You'll remember that we found trade documents from the Indus Valley civilization all the way in Mesopotamia. But for a few reasons, the scale of this trade has increased dramatically. 1. Multinational corporations have global reach and increasing power. 2. Travel and shipping are cheap and safe. It took about 2 months to cross the Atlantic in 1800. Today, it takes about 5 hours by plane and less than a week by ship. 3. Governments have decreased tariffs and regulations on international trade, leading to what is sometimes called, euphemistically, free trade. To which t-shirts made in the world contains 100% American cotton. And that's not because the US makes the best cotton or the most efficient cotton, it's because the US government subsidizes cotton production. And that's what makes this cotton cheaper than cotton of similar quality from Brazil or India. But in the last 30 years, the US's share of cotton exports has gone down as Brazil, India, and Africa's cotton exports go up. And that trend will likely continue as the US moves away from its expensive cotton subsidies. In fact, these days it's already possible to find t-shirts with Brazilian, Indian, or Ugandan cotton, or a mixture of cottons from all around the world. But because the American government doesn't subsidize industry in the way it does agricultural production, the actual spinning and weaving of the cotton takes place in lower wage countries: Mexico, Guatemala, Vietnam, China, India, China, sometimes even China. And then the finished shirts, called blanks, are usually sent to Europe or the United States for screen printing and then sold. You would think the most expensive part of this process is the part where we ship this across the Pacific Ocean, turn it into this, and then ship it back across the Pacific Ocean. But you'd be wrong. Wholesale t-shirt blanks can cost as little as $3. The expense is in the printing, the retail side, prosperity by limiting growth. Now, some nations in Latin America, the Caribbean, and Africa haven't been particularly keen to pursue free trade, but they've been bullied into it by larger economies with whom they desperately need to trade. The Industrial Revolution episode that industrial Western powers produced most of the manufactured goods, which were then sold in international markets. But you'll also remember that domestic consumption was extremely important. I mean, almost all early Model Ts were built by Americans and bought by Americans. But since the 1960s, and especially today, former non-industrialized parts of the world have been manufacturing consumer goods for domestic markets, yes, but primarily for foreign ones. This t-shirt, made in China and the Dominican Republic before being imported to Mexico and then to the United States, is a primary example of what I'm talking about, but so is the computer that you're watching me on. Your computer was probably manufactured in China, but with parts from all over the world, especially Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea. And this international manufacturing is always finding new markets too. Like Brazil, for instance, has a huge technology sector. They make iPads there, actually. Sorry, I'm trying to play Angry Birds. But what all these countries have in common is that while there is a domestic market for things like iPads and t-shirts, the foreign markets are much, much bigger. We're going to talk about all that next week. For today, let's bring on the bandwagon and ride straight for the thought bubble. So these days, people move more than they ever have. 21% of people living in Canada were born somewhere else, as was an astonishing 69% of Kuwait's current population. Migration has become easier because 1, air travel is pretty cheap, especially if you only take a few plane trips in your life, and 2, it's relatively easy and inexpensive to stay in touch with relatives living far away thanks to Skype, mobile phones, and inexpensive calling cards. Also 3, even with increased industrialization in the developing world, economic opportunities are often much better in wealthy countries. Remittances, money sent home by people working abroad, are now a huge driver of economic growth in the developing world. Like in Tajikistan, for instance, remittances are 35% of the country's total gross domestic product. With all these people moving around the world, it's not surprising that globalization also means cultural blending. When people move, they don't just give up their literary, culinary, artistic, and musical traditions. Globalized culture is a bit of a paradox, though, because some people see culture today as increasingly Americanized, right? Like, Friends is currently broadcast in over 100 countries. You can find Diet Coke for sale deep in the jungles of Madagascar. The NBA is huge in China. There are fewer languages spoken today and probably less cultural diversity. But on the other hand, an individual's access to diverse cultural experience has never been greater. Bollywood movies, Swedish hip-hop, Brazilian soap operas, highlights from Congolese football matches, these are all available to us. Culinary cultural fusion is all the rage. More novels are translated from languages than ever before, although few are actually read. And in the surest sign of cultural globalization, football, the world's game, has finally reached America, where broadcasts of the greatest collective enterprise humanity has ever known, Liverpool Football Club, got record ratings in 2012. 10 times as much work. But these improvements have been accompanied by change so radical that we struggle to contextualize it. Like, the human population of our planet over time looks like this. Dang. Like in 1800, there were 1 billion human beings on this planet, and that was more than had ever been seen before. And we live more than twice as long on average as humans did just 2 centuries ago, largely due to improved healthcare for women in childbirth and their infants, but also thanks to antibiotics and the second agricultural revolution that began in the 1950s, the so-called Green Revolution that saw increased use of chemical fertilizers lead to dramatically higher crop yields. It's easy to feel that we are big and powerful, maybe even invincible. It's easy to feel that. And also dangerous. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next week. Crash Course is produced and directed by Stan Muller. Our script supervisor is Meredith Danko. Associate producer